Congressman James Clyburn, who has magically appeared in the seat where Pat Toomey was a moment ago. Congressman, welcome to Fox News Sunday.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get to the Democratic plan, I want to ask you the same question I started with Pat Toomey. Where do things stand right now? Where are the negotiations, and what do you think are the realistic chances you'll get a compromise within 10 days?
Well, I'm very hopeful that we will, and I feel very comfortable that we will. I am not as certain as I was 10 days ago. But I think that we can. We've got 10 days to do this, and I really believe that all of the ingredients for a good resolution are there. We just need to develop the will.
There have been talks, speaking of will, about not because the committee is charged with coming up with $1.2 trillion in deficit reduction, but there had been talk about going way beyond that, a grand bargain, $4 trillion. Is that now off the table?
Well, I hope it's not, because I am a full trillion-dollar guy. I do believe that we can do this. In fact, I think in order for us to be fair and balanced, if I might use that term,
go ahead, sir.
We ought to go to a big deal. That way we could do enough job creation in a resolution that would allow us to do some, I call surgical fixes to entitlement. I would love to see us put together a big deal that would increase the possibilities of a 75-year solvency for Social Security. And you cannot do that with a little deal. You got to have a big deal to do that.
All right, let's talk about the Democratic plan. It isn't specifically yours, but this is the Democratic plan that's on the... It offers $1 in spending cuts for every $1 in revenue increases. Now, the Bowles-Simpson Commission that was appointed by President Obama offered a 3-to-1 ratio, $3 in spending cuts for every $1 in revenue increases. And I guess my question is, isn't the deal that's on the table now much less attractive to Republicans than the president's own panel?
Well, you know, that is a Democrat's plan. That's not the Democratic plan. There are 6 Democrats on this committee, and though I have a great deal of admiration and respect for all of them, the fact of the matter is Democrats have not coalesced around a plan.
Well, isn't that a problem right there?
Sure.
10 days out that the Democrats don't have a plan.
Well, the Republicans don't have a plan. I think that we're there to develop a bipartisan plan, and that's why it's 6 and 6. And I do believe that we can get to a bipartisan plan. We've got to get realistic about these so-called tax increases. How do you define the closing of a loophole as a tax increase is beyond me. The fact of the matter is, if you've got someone who is supposed to be paying 30-35% in taxes, yet can find loopholes not to pay anything in taxes and say it's unfair to close that loophole, I don't quite understand that.
But that's not the, if I may, wait, Congressman, that's not the typical situation. Let's say you're fortunate enough to be in the 35% bracket, and let's say you take a mortgage deduction on your home. Now, if instead of getting the full value of that deduction, you got 2/3 of it, you're paying more in taxes. That's a tax increase.
Well, that's not all that we're talking about here. We're talking about the loopholes that will allow you to go down to 0 in taxes. And I think that it's unfair for us to sit out and say to a person who's making billions of dollars, we're going to allow you a tax or decrease of another $300,000 a year, while we are then going to take away Medicare for people living on fixed income. That is just not fair. What we ought to be saying is, let's find a balanced way to do this. And let's say to those who are fortunate enough to be in that upper 1%, who's had 275% increase in their earnings over the last 28 years, let's say, come on, let's tone this down and put you where you were 28 years ago relative to the rest of the country.
Okay. Let me ask you about one other thing which the Republicans say is unfair about the Democrats. Since it's not your plan, the Democratic plan that is out there would count hundreds of billions of dollars in savings from winding down the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that would be applied to entitlements, things like that. Isn't that a classic Washington budget gimmick to count savings on money that was never going to be spent in the first place?
That is not. In fact, that's much more realistic than this so-called pro-growth economy, which
well,
is...
I'm asking you about this, though. Counting money from wars that weren't going to be fought?
We believe, and CBO believes, that there is around $917 billion to be saved over the next 10 years from the overseas contingency account. And we ought to count that. We ought to use that savings to plow back into a fix on Social Security that will allow it to be solvent for another 75 years, to plow into job creation programs that will get us people back to work and paying taxes and offer food stamps and offer unemployment insurance.
We got about 30 seconds left,
yes.
And I'm not saying you're right or Pat Toomey is right, but I got to say, watching the two of you today, it doesn't sound like there's any progress at all. I mean, you're talking to the Democratic talking points. He's sticking to the Republican talking points.
About 2/3 of what Pat Toomey has put on the table, I'll tell you, and that may shock you. What I'm not for is trying to count something that CBO will not score. The legislation is very clear. We got to come up with a plan that CBO will score, not that Pat Toomey will dream about. And it's a dream, I believe, that if you do this and if you do that, it will create all this dynamic growth. Dynamic scoring is not the way to do this. Let's put down the actual numbers, tax cuts, tax increases, entitlement cuts, and entitlement increases, and let's find a fair and balanced approach.
Love that phrase. Congressman Clyburn, thank you. Thanks for updating us on the talks. Sounds to me like you guys have a lot of work to do in 10 days.
Yes, we do, but we've got a lot of time.
Okay. A lot of time.
Yeah, 10 days.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Coming up, we'll ask our Sunday group about a wild week